Hello, I'm psychiatrist, author, and neuroscientist Dr. John Kruse, and I'm going to be telling you about how ADHD just saved Donald Trump's life, or how having a neuroatypical brain in this modern world has both upsides and downsides. Now, recently, an assassin's bullet missed Donald Trump's brain by mere millimeters. There's been huge media attention to this major event. He is alive and functioning well. That's a good thing. But there's been lots of speculation about what the gunman's motivations are. That remains murky at this point. But there's been very little focus or attention on Mr. Trump's immediate role in the seconds before the event. And I will present evidence that I think is convincing and reasonable to conclude that ADHD just saved his life. And specifically, it was his hyperactivity that saved his life. Now, I'm aware that I'm not going to convince those of you who think the whole event was under some sort of divine intervention. I also know that Trump has already credited his head movement to the chart he was describing. But his head was never still throughout the whole rally, so this was not just a single moment where he looked at a chart and that deflected his brain from the trajectory of a bullet. So who I am talking to are those who want to understand how brains work, and particularly those who want to understand how the brains of presidential candidates work. So I'll be trying to inform people about ADHD, not only how we can know how Trump has it, but also going into the fact that millions of Americans have ADHD, or millions worldwide certainly have undiagnosed ADHD and untreated ADHD, and learning more about ADHD can save lives. So how do we know Trump has ADHD? This has been much less widely discussed in the media than whether he has narcissistic traits or sociopathic traits, or even whether he's using drugs. But there have been numerous people who have talked about his ADHD. I have a book written about it called Recognizing Adult ADHD, what Donald Trump can teach us about adult attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And he has been displaying ADHD symptoms for years that robustly fulfill the whole criteria for ADHD. I will try to give a summary of it here, but again, my book's available out there if you want to go into more detail. So in a multitude of settings, not just one place, not just one situation, since childhood, he's displayed hyperactive, impulsive, and inattentive symptoms that are severe enough to cause both distress and dysfunction to himself and those around him, and that these behaviors are markedly in excess for someone of his age and of his background. Now, the official objective and observable criteria for ADHD are written in terms of observable behaviors. So unlike all our other mental health diagnoses where we need to know motivation, what's internal thought process, we don't need to know that for ADHD. They are not part of the official criteria. There are 18 criteria. 9 of them are inattentive symptoms, 9 of them are hyperactive and impulsive symptoms. An adult only needs to pervasively be showing 5 of those symptoms. So Mr. Trump readily, robustly, and undeniably displays well more than 5, and I'll list the symptoms I'm sure that he displays. And it's important to remember that these symptoms are patterns of behavior, that he has to do this excessively in situation after situation. That doesn't mean in every instant he has to display each symptom, but it does mean that a robust or an exciting or an interesting anecdote about someone misplacing an item or someone forgetting a fact, an isolated anecdote, may be representative of ADHD or may be representative of something completely different. And all of the behaviors that we're going to talk about for ADHD are things that normal people do at least some of the time. So I'm sure I'm going to be misspeaking or saying something in the however many minutes this video is going to take. That doesn't mean that I have ADHD. Again, it's a pattern of persistently in multiple situations doing these things. So number 1, he fails to attend to details and makes careless mistakes. Is some of this due to intentional hyperbole or narcissistic traits? Probably, but he makes mistakes often enough But, and I'll get to it later, narcissism doesn't seem an explanation. 2, he has difficulty sustaining attention. His security staff, when they brief him on upcoming events or threats to the country, would comment that he gets bored before you get even, they've condensed his, when he was president, security briefings to the briefest of brief, he would still get bored and not make it through the end of even a brief briefing. We've seen at press conferences where he has difficulty sustaining attention. Doesn't listen when spoken to directly. Numerous examples of that. Doesn't follow through on instructions or on his own plans. How much of the wall got built? How much did he collect from Mexico for that? How many of other major products? He was going to get rid of Obamacare. He was going to have an infrastructure bill. He had a favorable Congress. None of these things materialized, largely because he didn't follow through. And again, aides from his own party, people who support him and support his policies, have repeatedly attested to all of these things. Has difficulty organizing tasks, has poor time management, check. Avoids engaging in tasks that require sustained effort. So there are, this is a man who has bragged that he has never read a book in his life. Is often distracted by extraneous stimuli, so part of his response in many settings, whether it's a rally or elsewhere, he's always responding both to hecklers who don't like him and to people cheering him on. He gets distracted, he gets pulled off his message, he gets back onto it, but he's highly distractible. Getting into some of the hyperactive symptoms, fidgeting, moving his hands, tapping his hands and feet, and shifting in position. It's easiest to see this when he's in a group setting, to see what other adults are doing, but there it's manifestly clear he is the one who's always in motion, always fidgeting, always gesturing, always twisting his body around. Leaves a seat when sitting expected. There were numerous photo ops during his presidency, which he marred by moving around when everyone else was standing in position ready to smile for the cameras. Again, a single isolated example that does not prove it, but he has a pervasive pattern of this. Always on the go, looks like he's driven by a motor. He's talked about how energetic he is. He does, at least when he's in the public domain, seems to be a very active man. Talks excessively is another symptom. Blurts out answers without waiting for others or talking over the others, has difficulty waiting his turn, and interrupts or intrudes on others' physical space. We've seen multiple examples of all these. Those are the criteria for ADHD. So again, there's no question he fulfills the official criteria. Does that mean that's the only thing going on with his brain? No, but that is a prominent piece and has to be understood before you try to explain other aspects of how his brain works. Now, there's a common claim in the ADHD field that, kids are hyperactive who have it, but all those kids outgrow those symptoms. And they may outgrow the most extreme of literally running around in circles. I saw my kids were in grade school. Some of their ADHD classmates literally, when they were supposed to be sitting still, were literally running around in circles or standing up on chairs, doing all sorts of things. Most adults with ADHD are not showing that excessive degree of movement, but they do tend to still talk excessively, especially having trouble modulating the volume of their speech, even when they're not particularly angry. They have excessive gestures, fidgeting, drumming on the table, making other noises to not intentionally disrupt others, but just because that hyperactivity needs an outlet. And Trump himself has frequently boasted of how energetic he is and how he contrasts this to his rivals, either in the Republican field or Democratic rivals. So we've all seen examples of Trump wandering around in the midst of photo opportunities when he paces or fidgets. So some people have interpreted, particularly when he's intruding on others' space, when he's cutting others off, when he's interrupting, that these are more aspects of his narcissism, that they're intentional actions to show dominance or disregard for other people. Some of that may be true, but very often we have seen that these events have mostly served to embarrass Trump if he were able to display signs of embarrassment, but at the very least, he himself shows surprise when he's caught in an area he didn't expect to be or trapped. So that both the surprise and that these actions don't actually fit or support his claim that he's a stable genius, or what a narcissist would want people to believe, that they are always in control and always superior to others. These behaviors so often undermine that narrative, it's hard to come up with an explanation for how narcissism alone could explain this hyperactivity. And not only is Trump's activity excessive for people of his age and background, a decrease in his hyperactivity is one of the physiologic markers that we can use to monitor and know when Trump takes a stimulant medication. So in some of the debates and other presentations, he was making more than 45 gestures, movements, and I described a movement as moving at least 10 centimeters of torso, head, body, some part of him, twisting, turning, gesturing, more than 45 a minute, way far more than most people would be doing. And when he takes stimulants, that drops threefold down to about 15 points a minute. The other two signs of when he's taking stimulant medications is his speech becomes more coherent, so that one sentence follows another, whether they're truthful, whether they're sensible or not. There's some coherence or follow-through, and pupils being dilated. But I'm not going to talk more about that right now. I'm going to move back to, and don't shake your head at this, the importance of head movements. So much of the official criteria focuses on general body movements, but it's well known in the ADHD field that excessive head movements are classic for ADHD. And in fact, there's two particular situations where this is well documented and important. One is in collecting functional MRI or other brain imaging data. Many of the earlier studies were faulted as that the head movements of individuals with ADHD distorted any possible interpretation of whether a certain brain area was active or not. So there are now specific protocols put in place to control for the head movement of people with ADHD when they are in brain imaging studies, particularly functional MRI. The second thing is that there's at least one company that for several years now has been making an ADHD diagnostic test where the core of their test is actually video recording tiny head movements, and the people with ADHD make excessive number of head movements. And I am sure, although they haven't revealed this to us now, that Apple, Google, and other big data companies actually have a pretty good idea who is sitting at their computer has ADHD, because they are monitoring head movements, eye movements, response times, how quickly you click on something, how long you sustain your activity. And again, head movement is an important part of that. And they are probably identifying ADHD with greater accuracy than we are by modern psychological assessments. Now, the head movements in the MRIs or the diagnostic approaches are micro movements. There we're talking on the millimeter or less framework, barely detectable or not detectable by human eye. What I think saved Trump's life are macro movements of many millimeters to a few centimeters. He's always making those, and there's sort of a fractal geometry to head movements. So we have these tiny, tiny micro movements we can't really easily detect. They're the macro movements we see when someone's moving their head around. And those macro head movements are superimposed on the whole body movements. If you're pacing, walking around, that's another level of your actual head is moving to. And some would extend that fractal geometry pattern even greater, that there are some individuals with ADHD who are so adept at shaking up the whole world that that's causing another level of vibrations or movements. Now, during the rally, Trump's head was constantly in motion, shaking, nodding, swerving in response to the audience. I think two things as to how that helped save his life. One, it meant that he's a much harder target than for someone who's locked onto their lectern and holding still and is just a frozen, immobile target. And two, it meant that his head wasn't where it was just microseconds earlier when a bullet came charging towards him. So the bullet just nicked him, but that degree of movement was the margin between a bloodied ear and a bullet in the brain. Now, some people think I'm bringing up ADHD because that's only a derogatory thing, it's only a negative thing. I just pointed out that it saved Mr. Trump's life, so I do not believe it is only a negative. And again, his excessive head movements driven by his ADHD were instrumental in dodging the proverbial bullet. And while hyperactivity itself is seldom considered an advantage among adults, although it may be among some professional athletes who have talked about their ADHD, the high energy level that many people have, or at least for bursts of time with ADHD, is often listed as one of the ADHD superpowers. And again, Trump himself has boasted of his high energy levels and contrasted that to his rivals. So another aspect of ADHD, and this one is much harder to study rigorously, but many of the adults with ADHD I've worked with, and if you talk to any other ADHD expert, if you go online, report that with another aspect of ADHD, so people with ADHD in everyday boring situations have a tendency to be scattered, distracted, ineffectual, not staying on track, not completing tasks. But in a crisis situation, many of them report how they can focus immediately on the problem at hand, respond immediately and quickly with appropriate solutions at a time when other non-ADHD individuals are overwhelmed, flustered, frozen, freaked out, just can't work. And what we saw in this recent assassination attempt with, other than maybe the possible yet unexplained emphasis on what was going on with the shoes, Trump responded quickly, he responded appropriately, he got out of the way, and he had the presence of mind within seconds to turn this into a victorious photo op opportunity for himself. So clearly he displayed what many others with ADHD view as one of the positive attributes of this condition. There are certainly other positive attributes of ADHD, and many of Trump's supporters or fans appreciate one in particular, and that is, this is someone who speaks without reflection. He says what's ever on the top of his mind. His followers or people who like that interpret his willingness to voice whatever he's saying as evidence that he's not hiding anything, that he's not being manipulative or secretive or plotting in some way. I believe that his candor, although it conveys a can-do attitude, whether or not it's actually tied to being truthful or whether the events he's talking about or things are even possible, so truthfulness is separate from candor. They are different dimensions. So Trump also gets praised for being unconventional in his decisions and actions, and I think he thinks outside the box. He does things that normal politicians don't do. Again, many people see this as an attribute. This is tied to ADHD in two different ways. One, it's a direct expression of the nonlinear thinking style characteristic of those with ADHD. But secondly, as I talked about when I listed the symptoms, ADHD contributes to individuals not engaging in tasks that require sustained effort. They don't do their homework. When Trump was lobbying for passage of his own tax bill, the Republican congressman he was lobbying reported he didn't even know what was in the bill or it was talking about. When he tried to destroy the Obamacare bill, he didn't know what was in the bill. He couldn't make convincing arguments to people he was trying to convince of. So not being prepared, not having the facts is also contributing. He's able to come up with unconventional solutions because he doesn't even know in many situations what's been tried before and what didn't work or what might be possible to work. So I would hope, there have been some calls for us to come together as a nation. I would hope we can view this recent incident with Trump as a teaching moment, because again, there are millions of Americans with diagnosed ADHD, but they still face tremendous ignorance and stigma from the general public or people who don't understand what ADHD is. And there are many others who have this condition, but it remains undiagnosed. So when I wrote my book several years ago, I was contacted by a number of people who, including a guy in his 80s, who said, "Oh my God, you've just solved the riddle of my life. All these things you described are ADHD symptoms I've displayed. Nobody knew about it in kids when I was little. Nobody knew about it in adults when I was working, but now so much of my life makes sense." So there are still many individuals out there who have ADHD. We need to raise awareness of this, and part of it is that ADHD is not just a trivial condition. It's not just, oh, there's a squirrel. It derails people's education, and these are measurable facts. That doesn't mean everyone with ADHD has all these problems, but statistically derails education, disrupts careers, destroys relationships, reduces your likelihood you're going to be financially viable as an adult in this country. And even if we've just discussed in depth an anecdote or a situation where ADHD saved a life, more often it actually results in cutting lives prematurely short. And in fact, kids who are diagnosed with ADHD live about 10 years shorter than their non-ADHD peers. That's a big impact on longevity, as having diabetes, having depression. So this is a serious condition. ADHD. So the other thing that's really important to clarify is, while ADHD is a powerful force that shapes our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, it's only ever one part of any individual. Individuals with ADHD are not necessarily alike in other aspects, any more than all men are alike, or all Americans are alike, or all Christians are alike, or all people with narcissistic personality disorder are alike. It is one really important set of traits and characteristics, but everyone with ADHD isn't, quote, acting like Trump. There are other factors, there are other specifics to his background, his experiences in life that have shaped who he is. But I would get back to Trump's behavior is incomprehensible without an understanding of his ADHD. Trump could be the poster boy for adult ADHD because he displays so many of the symptoms to such an extreme degree. And he could be an ambassador for helping Americans to understand ADHD and the impact it has on people's lives, behavior, speech, interactions with others. It will save more lives if all of us spend more time thinking about ADHD. Thanks for tuning in.